Welcome to today's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast, your channel for super easy, no-nonsense advice on how to declutter and organise your home. Please welcome your hosts, professional organisers Ingrid Jansen and Leslie Spellman.
Hello and welcome listeners to episode 51 of the Declutter Hub podcast. We're Ingrid and Leslie and we're helping people declutter their homes. Check out members.declutterhub.com for more information on our step-by-step online courses, live Q&A sessions we do every 2 weeks, our membership community, and our checklists and guides. In today's podcast, Leslie and I are talking about loft and attic organizing. This is a 3-part series and this is the first part. So the first part, we're going to talk about all the reasons why there is so much stuff in your loft. And the second part, we're going to talk about decluttering and logistics of loft organizing. And in the third episode, we're going to talk about organizing your loft and zoning it properly. So Leslie, three podcast episodes about loft organizing.
Well, it's such a big thing to do, isn't it, really, to organise and declutter a loft. It's quite daunting. It takes a while. It needs a lot of planning. And so if we talked about it all in one go, we would be talking for an hour and a half about a loft, and that would not be good. So we thought we'd break it down, and I think, it makes sense the way we've broken it down. So before we do any decluttering project, try and think about the emotions and habits that you've got in your life that are making you do certain things, because once you've got those nailed and once you understand your own behaviours, it's much easier then to go through and declutter and then do the organisation at the end of it.
Yeah. Now, you and I probably both have seen a fair share of lofts that are absolutely filled to the rafters or are quite full. And I think the thing we hear all the time is like people saying to us, we're so overwhelmed. There's so much stuff. I don't even know anymore what's up there. We're so overwhelmed. Where do we start? How do we do this?
I think the interesting thing about lofts is, for me, sometimes they are, when I'm working with a client, and so obviously when we're working with clients, that's because clients find it quite difficult to work on their own and to make those decisions on their own, or logistics or whatever. There's lots of different reasons. But quite often a loft is one of the easier places in the home to work, because those things are things that have been put up there years ago. They've been things that have been put up there because people are not quite sure. And so it's almost like it's easier because we've already made a decision that they're not fit for being in our home at that point. And so they've gone somewhere else. It's almost like a halfway house in some ways. So once you get stuck in, sometimes a loft can be a really easy space to declutter.
Mm-hmm. I know. I mean, the amount of empty appliance boxes I found in lofts is like, well, we can recycle these. Yay. And you create lots of space already. And it's easier than you think it is sometimes.
Yeah, certainly the emotions are difficult to work your way through. The decluttering is difficult only because of the logistics, really, I think, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And then the zoning and organisation. And let me tell you, once you get your loft zoned and organised well, it's really, really good. And it makes you feel so much better. Because I think lofts, if they're full and disorganised and full of junk, they really sort of weigh down heavy on our minds, don't they?
Yeah. I think we always, although we can't see it, we know it's there.
We definitely do. We definitely do. And it's right there over our heads, and, it's tricky. It's tricky. So we wanted to talk anyway today about the psychology of why we do things. So first and foremost, it's all about procrastination, isn't it?
Yeah. Let's not make the decision now. Let's just put it up there and we'll do it another time.
Definitely. So it's, again, what we've said, it's this halfway house thing. We don't want to make the decision, so we put it up there and leave it for a rainy day, really. So a loft is full of delayed decision making everywhere, isn't it? It comes out of under every rafter and out of every plastic or cardboard box. So procrastination is a key emotion that people feel in terms of loft organising. So beware the procrastination. Make that decision today. Even when we're doing standard decluttering, there's so many people, and certainly in lofts, what we read a lot about, it's interesting the kind of things that you read in magazines and articles, isn't it? And people who are not, maybe that have written articles that are not in the industry and don't understand the psychology as well as we do, talk about this idea of, if you don't want to make a decision about something, put it in a cardboard box, put a date on it, put it in the loft and revisit it in 6 months' time. Now, I would absolutely, wholeheartedly recommend that's a really bad idea. You need to make a decision at the time that you look at that item. And if it's too difficult for you to part with at that time, keep it. Don't put it in a box. Don't put it up in the loft, because all you're doing is you're pushing it out of your psyche, and you're never going to go up there in 6 months and think, oh, today's the 1st of August. I am going to revisit the decisions that I couldn't make 6 months ago. It's kind of crazy. So I don't believe in that as a suitable strategy. What about you?
I don't think I've ever packaged something up and put a date on it. I can't ever remember doing that. I think I always say, let's try and make the decision now. And if it's a super difficult decision, you're obviously not ready to let it go. And
exactly,
you are allowed to revisit it. I mean, maybe in 6 months' time or a year's time or 2 years' time, you think about it differently. But I've never written a date on a box and go, in 6 months' time, let's do this box again. You see the same stuff again.
But you tell me that you've never read about that as a strategy in an article.
All the time. You read about it all the time. And I'm really wondering how they do. I'm like, why would you do that?
It doesn't make any sense. So first and foremost, what a loft is lots of decisions that we decided that we couldn't make on that day that we shoved up there, hoping that we're going to be able to make that decision in 6 months' time. But don't do that now going forwards. Don't do that from your house. Don't put things in a box and put them up there, because that's just asking for trouble. It's asking for those boxes to just keep breeding and for you never to tackle them.
Very true. And I think also, let's then talk about, you mentioned something like living for life in the past or the future. Can you explain that to me?
I know you found this quite interesting, didn't you? So I always think that there are so many things in a loft that represent our past life and potentially our future life. And we keep on hold of things from the past and the future and don't focus on the current. And so obviously we know what kind of things are from our past. It's going to be memory boxes, all those things that we've kept for years, clothes that we don't fit in, sentimental stuff. But the future stuff that finds its way into a loft is things, certainly someone my age, and I've got kids that are they're not on the way out yet, but Luke's just left home. And so a lot of people will keep things there, that might come in when my son or daughter leaves home, and they might need that dining suite, or they might need that old kettle, or they might need that old dinner service that I haven't used anymore. The chances are they are unlikely to. I knew Luke was moving out. And so I was like, that might come in for him, asking him, did he want it? He probably wanted 10 or 20% of the stuff. But actually, he wanted to do things on his own. He wanted to create his own home space. He didn't want a load of hand-me-downs from me. But so many lofts are full of that kind of stuff, full of things that we've taken out of our house that we think are going to be useful for someone else. If you think that they're going to be useful for someone else, send them off to charities, send them off to homeless charities, send them off, there's homeless charities where people are setting up homes and things like that. That's a perfect opportunity for you to offload those kind of things at the time and make sure they're relevant for somebody, because otherwise they'll sit up in the loft for 20 years. And you and I both know there is decades of stuff up in a loft from years and years and years ago. And so those are the kind of things that sit there, because you're never going to say, today's the day that I'm going to take out the dining table from my grandparents that I've had up there for the last 70 years. So yeah, it's all about, do we live our life in the past? Do we live our life in the future? Or do we really focus on the current? And obviously with decluttering, with all, yes, we need to remember the past. I'm not saying eradicate everything from your past, and I'm not saying don't keep anything for your kids, but be sensible about that. And everything that we need should serve our current life and not a life in the past or in the future. That's what I'm talking about.
I think I find it that's very interesting, because I think it's all about finding that balance, isn't it? It's exactly what you're saying. It's a lot of people think just because we are declutterers, we don't want to keep anything. That's not true at all. But I think we really want to remind people to keep the important things. I have a crib in my loft because it's a family heirloom. Father-in-law was in it, and my husband was in it, and my son and daughter were both in it, and I'm hoping it will be passed down for future. But that's one thing. I don't have a whole loft full of every equipment ever passed down through the generations. So I keep the important things that are important to me and my family. Message, I think I really want our listeners to understand that we're not about exactly what you're saying, eradicating the past, but keeping the stuff that's important.
Balance and compromise is what it's all about. A lot of this is about whether space allows and whether it's impacting on the life that you've got today. If your loft is impacting on the life that you've got today and the stuff that you've got in there, because do you know what I mean? And there's stuff that you quite like to get your camping equipment or your Christmas decorations up in the loft, which would be a sensible thing to do. But you can't do that because you can't even get in there because of all the stuff from 30 years ago. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. So a lot of this is dictated by space as well. Obviously we need to make decisions for the right reasons, but some people struggle with that more than others. And so it's just never as simple as that. Mm-hmm. But it is about focusing. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get you to tackle the emotions that you've got and to really think those through. Think those through, because the chances are your kids are not going to want any of that stuff that you're keeping. And you probably know this in your heart of hearts, and that's when it becomes sentimental, that your kids, when they have kids in probably 15, 20 years' time, are not going to want an old crib because of health and safety, because of hygiene, because of all those kind of things. It's a nice idea. So you're keeping it for yourself. There's a small chance that they might want it, mm-hmm. but it's unlikely. And so actually it's more for yourself than it is for them. And it's understanding those emotions and everything. And it's hard. There's so many, when we're working with lofts, it is quite emotionally difficult because often I work with people who are keeping things for another baby, and so part of my job is to say, but is that something that you're going to do? Are you going to have another baby? And sometimes it's saying goodbye to a chapter of your life that you don't want to say goodbye to as well. So it's difficult, it's these decisions and emotions, even though I said it right at the beginning, I'm changing everything that I said where it's like quite easy. There are certain things within a loft that are difficult because it is about saying goodbye to a chapter of your life, whether that's work, whether that's the fact that you are not going to have another baby, things like that all come into play in a loft because that's exactly where that kind of stuff lives.
But some items are easy as well. I mean, I recently found some Luxaflex, like curtain things up in the loft because they had the previous owners had put their old stuff in the loft and the new owners of the house put all new like blinds and everything on there. So that was an easy thing, but because the loft was huge and they thought, oh, never mind, we'll just put it up there. And now 20 years later, it's all dusty and it's yucky and it's no good for anybody anymore. Well, maybe at the time when they would have said, we're not going to use this anymore, we can give it away to somebody. It would have still been useful to somebody else. But now after being stuck in a loft for 15 years, it's all dusty and yucky and the ropes are yellow or gray and black. And nobody can use it anymore. And now it has to be thrown away, unfortunately.
Exactly. So there are so many things in a loft that are very straightforward, like that kind of thing, like old tiles. We keep tiles, don't we, and things like that when we redo bathrooms and kitchens. And sometimes I'm going to find tiles from the previous kitchen. Do you know what I mean? So those kind of things can go. Like you say, old curtains and things. It's all about knowledge, really, isn't it? A lot of things, the kind of things that you're talking about at the moment with old curtains, hand-me-downs, we're not quite sure what to do with them. It's about knowledge. Or, I know that somebody would really benefit from that, but who's that going to be? I think times have got a little bit better, and the internet and the kind of local Facebook groups, we can ask those kind of questions. And so, but in years gone by, it was just much more difficult to know what to do with things like family heirlooms or expensive furniture or things like that. But now we do have the internet to help us out on that.
Yeah. I think there's also lots of stuff like, exactly what you said, it might come in handy one day. You never know when I might need it. And like a good friend, I think it was our good friend Juliet who said, one day is not a day of the week, which is, I think, a brilliant quote. But it's all that stuff up there as well, isn't it? You never know when we might need it again. And it's like, it's been there for 30 years. When is that going to happen?
I know it's a classic kind of old electrical things that people keep up there, appliance boxes that people keep up there. Those are the classics. I might need it one day, just in case, aren't there? There's an awful lot of that kind of stuff that finds its way into lofts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and of course also I think a lot of sentimental items are up there. Stuff from people, maybe from parents who've passed away, memory boxes. I think that's probably the hardest in all the loft stuff. that is probably the hardest one to go through, isn't it, Leslie?
Yeah, and I think the things with sentimental items, I'm not against people putting sentimental things up in a loft, but so it's not about, I can understand why they go up there in the first place. Some things in a loft, I can't understand why they go up there in the first place. Sentimental stuff absolutely deserves its place going up in the loft. But you have to go through these things on a reasonably regular basis. And by that, I don't mean every 6 months. I mean every couple of years, probably, so that it doesn't become completely overwhelming and you have to store it appropriately, which we'll obviously talk about in part 3 of our podcast.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a lot of sentimental stuff. And I think, depending on what it is, those kind of things, those kind of certificates and artwork from your kids and, letters, those kind of things from your parents, those are the kind of things that should be in a loft. Other things, pictures, ornaments, really, they should probably be down in your house. Do you know what I mean? So it's different. It's different. So I can understand why sentimental stuff goes up there, and that's absolutely the place for it, for a lot of that type of stuff. But we do need to have a process that we're going through that regularly, so it doesn't become overwhelming and take over your entire loft space.
Yeah, very, very true. And I think also then I'm thinking about family, we're talking about parents, but I think also it's the hand-me-downs within families that live in lofts as well. And people just find it really difficult because I think they feel guilty that they're going to make a decision about it. But it's like, well, if it's in your loft gathering dust and nobody's using it, that's also a waste, isn't it?
I can absolutely guarantee that, loads and loads of our listeners have probably got 10, 12 bin bags of stuff that's been handed down over the years because, as soon as your kids grow so fast, particularly in those early years, don't they? And we have so much stuff and it costs so much money and they wear it for such a short amount of time that there's a huge amount of guilt wrapped up in just letting all that stuff go. Obviously, our advice would be send it to charity if you can. But if you are going to hand it down to somebody, to a friend or to somebody else in the family, make sure that they want it. Make sure that you then give them permission to let go of it if they don't want it. It's that kind of thing. But hand-me-downs and bags of clothes in particular is a big one, a really big one in lofts.
Yeah. And I think it's also... It is in bin bags and it's not labeled. It's not so. It's also an absolute nightmare to actually sort it out when you actually want to look for something. So, and I think that's why it's so important. We're doing a podcast about organizing and zoning later. So, if you do decide you want to keep some stuff, you can actually find it. But it's often very unclear if people give you stuff, what needs to happen to it when you're done with it. So, I think when somebody gives you something, at the time when they give it to you, ask them, what do you want me to do with this when I'm done using with it? Do you want it back? Can I give it to somebody else? If it is broken, can I throw it away? Or can I declutter it? Or can I charity shop it? So it's much less up in the air what needs to happen to this item, because otherwise it will end up in your loft.
And then it takes away from the guilt then. If you've had express permission from somebody, either to, and that's not just when you're done with it, as I said a minute ago, I think it's also, if there will undoubtedly be things from your sister's baby that you don't want because actually when you look at it, it's got little stick stains down the front of it, or you don't like it, or it's a little bit old-fashioned or whatever. Have you then got permission to send it straight to charity at that point? Or do they want it back to give it to somebody else, for example? But it's all about our guilt, isn't it? And we talk about guilt in other podcasts. I mean, guilt is a huge one in the decluttering world, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just about laying down some guidelines, I think, for yourself with your friends or with people that are giving you things as to what the future looks like for those items.
Yeah, very good point. I also regularly find valuables up in a loft, like a tea set or some nice plates or some glasses or silver cutlery that people actually really don't want to use at all. But it belonged to their family, it belonged to their parents, but they really never see themselves using it. But they're kind of unsure what to do with it, and that's why it kind of ends up in a loft.
It may be something that's actually got value, and you're not sure. So you don't want to make a mistake by giving it away. I think that's the point, isn't it? So that's where, as I mentioned before, that's where the internet comes in, because there are some tea sets, for example. There's things like China Search that buy individual teacups and plates and things like that. Those kind of services, if you want to make some money out of things, are perfect. So nowadays we can find everything, can't we, on our fingertips on the internet. So we're very lucky, really. But a lot of the stuff that will be in there will have already been there pre-internet. Do you know what I mean? So it kind of depends on the size. If you're younger and you've only been in your house 5 years, that's not the case. But certainly if it's an older home, things have been there a long, long time. Whenever I do a loft declutter with people, often at least half or 2/3 of the stuff will go out of that loft, because it's quite a simple space to declutter, because there's lots of stuff that really shouldn't have been up there in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting one, really. It really is.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's funny you mentioned China Search, because I've now put out the search, because I dropped a cup of my lovely tea set. So I actually want to make it complete again. So I've actually now put out a search for a teacup. So yeah, they really are helpful. And there are ways to find out if your stuff has value with, Googling a little bit and trying to find. So you feel better about making the decision, because if you find out it's maybe not so valuable as you thought, maybe it's easier to let it go then.
Exactly. No, and that's a nice thing. What we're doing with, what China Search is doing is taking stuff from people who don't want it anymore and giving it to people that do. And I know there's a paid element to that, but what a fantastic service for something that people do struggle with, which is dinner services. I worked for a client recently, and she was convinced that one of her dinner services would have value. I don't know whether a Royal Dalton service from 50 years ago that to me looks quite old-fashioned has got any value, because fashions change all the time. But, a quick search on China Search and on eBay showed that it didn't have any value. So then she was quite happy to let it go. And I passed it on to, there's a lot of people with these sort of vintage coffee mornings and things. They love that kind of thing. Yeah. So it's nice if you can find a good home for things.
Yeah.
One trash is another man's treasure.
Definitely. A loft can be such a difficult place to declutter, because it's just so awkward to get into. So we kind of think, we'll just open the loft latch, we kind of chuck it in, and we'll deal with it another time.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? There's so many things. I mean, how many times do you go to a house when there are boxes at the bottom of the loft ladder where people are like, that's ready to go up into the loft? You might be a mum at home or a dad at home with little kids, and you don't want to go up into the loft when there's so many things that stop us from putting stuff immediately into the loft. And that's exactly the reason why it becomes a complete dumping ground. Because what we don't do is we don't treat it in the same way that we do the rest of the rooms in our house. We treat it somehow differently. And that goes back to us talking about out of sight, out of mind. You know what I mean? Like, once it's up there, no one's going to see it. It doesn't matter. No one who's going to be a guest in my house is going to see my loft. It's just between me and my family what's up there. And so it becomes this complete dumping ground, and that's what creates the overwhelm, and that's what means that we just chuck stuff up there. And as soon as you start chucking boxes in, that's the end, isn't it? It's you've got to do then probably a 2-day job trying to reorder it and get some organisation back into there.
Yeah, very much so. And it's also a lot of times what I see is that the loft ladder is quite wobbly itself. So you need to have somebody else there to make sure that they can actually hold the ladder and make sure you don't kind of crash down from the top, and you can go up safely and get down safely.
Exactly. So I think, logistics is something that we're going to talk about in part 2, isn't it? When we're talking about decluttering as well. But there's a reason why the loft becomes a dumping ground, and logistics definitely play a part in that, and the out of sight, out of mind psychology definitely plays a part in that too.
So listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this week's episode about loft organizing part 1, and that this weekend you're going to have a think about all the emotions that are connected to your stuff in your loft. So have a think about why stuff is in your loft, what is up there. And I hope you're looking forward to our part 2 of our loft organizing, when we're going to talk all about decluttering your loft next week. Please follow us on social media, have a listen to our podcast, and also check out our brand new membership site. it is now live, and we've got fantastic step-by-step courses on how to declutter. And every 2 weeks, Leslie and I are going to do a live Q&A, and there's lots of other cool stuff out there. So we'll definitely put a link in the show notes to our very cool online courses. So check that out if you'd like to know more. And we really appreciate you listening every week to us. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast. Check out declutterhub.com for more inspiration, and don't forget to tune in next week.